Good morning. In our last lecture, we looked at the Bayeux Tapestry, which commemorated the invasion of England by William the Conqueror. And we'll begin this lecture on Romanesque art with another monument that William the Conqueror was responsible for, and in part as a commemoration of the same victory. In the city of Caen, C-A-E-N, in France, in Normandy, William built two abbeys, and the one we're looking at the interior of now, looking at the nave of, is the abbey called Saint-Étienne, St. Stephen, begun in 1067. The vaulting that you're looking at in this nave is of the early 12th century, around 1115 or 1120. This is one of two, as I said, two abbeys that he built. The other one was dedicated to his queen and was inhabited by nuns. This abbey, sometimes called the Abbey of the Men, was for monks. Saint-Étienne is a very important church. The Normans who conquered England brought with them a well-developed architectural style. In England, that is logically called the Norman style, but we have come to call it Romanesque. And the name Romanesque conveys the fact that the building techniques were derived from ancient Roman architecture, especially in the use of the arch, an invention which had allowed Roman architects to span wider spaces than with the post and lintel system, with fewer supports, thus allowing more openness into the structure and instilling a more fluid feeling of space into the architecture. When the principle of the arch was developed to construct domes, a dome in a simple-minded way is just an arch turned on its axis. When domes were introduced, the spatial expansion was still more dramatic and allowed more light yet into the structure. I'll describe this very briefly, the interior of the Church of Saint-Étienne as you're looking at it. You're looking at the nave from the front toward the apse. The nave arcade, that is to say the series of arches on both sides of the nave, which march down the nave. A gallery level above that, a large open gallery, but a dark one. The windows were set far back in it, but you see they're high round arches on the gallery level, superimposed above the nave arcade, and above that a clerestory, as it's called, either spelled C-L-E-A-R-S-T-O-R-Y or C-L-E-R-E. I don't know how the two spellings, alternative spellings came to be, but both are correct. And that is the uppermost level, and the most light is admitted through the naves at the nave windows at the top, at the clerestory. And then you see the vaulting system. This is an early example of ribbed construction of vaults, in which the ribs, quite prominent and familiar to you all, the ribs, some of which are transverse, they go across the arch part of the nave, and others of which cross diagonally and intersect. These ribs become the main weight-bearing part of the vault because everything in between, the webbing, which is usually of brick, the webbing in between is not a supporting element and is light enough to be supported by the masonry which holds it together. So most of the weight from the roof above and so forth is carried by these arches. We'll say more about it when we discuss Gothic architecture, but this is an early example of the use of the ribbed vault, which Gothic architecture will develop to a much higher level. I'm going to turn now to the facade. Wonderful, memorable facade in a kind of cul-de-sac as it appears in this photograph at the end of a long courtyard. A facade which is simply overpowering in its grandeur. It is typical of Romanesque architecture to be massive, with broad expanses of exterior wall and heavy supports to hold them up, to buttress them. Because these buttressing elements are placed directly against the wall to be supported by them and jut prominently out from it, they're given the name salient buttresses. This is one. There are four across the facade. They are, as it were, thickenings of the facade that buttress it, and of course it takes place along the side of the church as well. The powerful towers are probably the most remarkable aspect of Saint-Étienne at Caen. They are enormous and they are symmetrical. That is not always true of medieval towers because they're built frequently at different times. But this church was built as a unit in a very short period of time, and so it has these wonderful symmetrical towers. These kinds of towers, this is in every major and even every lesser type of architecture that the world has seen. Whenever power is to be expressed, whether it be political or religious or military power, towers often come into play. Egyptian art has it, to be sure. It's known constantly, not just a tower, two towers, framing the facade and guarding the door. They have, the symbolism is simple-minded, but it's very hard to forget, very powerful. The Romanesque style arises coincidentally at a turning point in Western political history, when the large but transitory empires that Charlemagne and Otto the Great had forged on the battlefield and consecrated through the agency of the Roman Catholic Church were very gradually being replaced with the emerging sense of Europe as Europe. Sounds funny to be saying today in modern Europe with all of the discussions about a unified Europe. The Church, and to say Catholic and Christian are the same thing, of course, at this time until the Reformation, the Church remained very important, but it was now balanced by the rise of feudalism, that famous economic system based on land that gave peasants use of the land that was owned by the lords in return for service, often military, but often on the land. The lords owed allegiance to kings, but their own growing power gave them increasing independence. How's that for the short definition of feudalism? Enough books have been written about that. The Romanesque style is found throughout Europe, from about the middle of the 11th century until about the last third of the 12th century. And though it's derived from architectural innovations, the term also includes sculpture, painting, and the other arts of the period. There were distinct local variations of the Romanesque style, but that it is so widespread may suggest that a new concept of Europe as a political and cultural unit was developing. I always hate to leave Caen and that marvelous facade, but I'm going to go to the south of France to show you how widely it was spread. We go from Normandy to Arles, nearly at the Mediterranean. This is the facade of the Church of Saint-Trophime, about 1180. In the south of France, for obvious reasons, the Roman ruins, were much more substantial. The Romans spent a lot more time there. There were more of them. And the Roman ruins, whether architectural or sculptural, were just waiting to be emulated by medieval architects and artists. Arches, which you see in this facade, the center part, the doorway, and the arches, and more arches of the center of Saint-Trophime. And then the high relief sculptural figures, which you see, of course, above the door on the tympanum here. The tympanum is that semicircular shaped area above the lintel of a doorway and is usually used for sculpture in architecture of the Middle Ages. This one has God the Father in a mandorla, in an almond-shaped halo, with the four figures that represent the apocalypse. That represent, they're from the apocalypse, but they represent the apostles. Three of them are animals. One is an angel, a winged man. But I'm really more interested in the sculptural figures between the columns on either side of the door. These are very similar to those on Roman tombs, Roman sculpture on sarcophagi. And that kind of high relief sculpture you find borrowed very quickly, especially in the south of France. Indeed, it's the appearance of monumental stone sculpture, usually incorporated into architecture, that really distinguishes Romanesque art, for there was no precedent for this in either Carolingian or Ottonian art. I want to show you a beautiful map. Hard to read. Maps that are beautiful sometimes are, unless you're holding the whole expanse of it in your arms or on a table in front of you. But this map, which dates from 1648, is, as it says in the upper left-hand corner in its French inscription, is a map of the roads to St. James at Compostela. It is, in fact, a map of the pilgrimage roads, these famous roads which I'm about to discuss with you. Before I let this lovely but hard to read map go, let me just point out that most of the pilgrimages that were going to Santiago, and I'll talk about the other goals of pilgrims, but Santiago de Compostela is out here, sort of at Land's End in the northwest corner of Spain. Why it's there and why it's so important, we will talk about. The roads all led there, as it were, not to Rome, as is popularly said, but in the Middle Ages to Santiago. Up near the top of France, of that area, is Paris, which was a starting point for many of the pilgrimages. Vézelay, down about here, was a famous starting point for pilgrimages. Others further south, along the Rhone or in the area near the Mediterranean, but all of them converged toward northwest Spain. When you look at this wonderful, beautiful old map, you realize that there's a lot of intersection of roads too. It's not just, it sounds so simple. Road goes from here to there. No, they were constantly crossing off, crossing each other, having dead ends and coming back. There was a tremendous web of these, and they are part of the economic substance of this part of the Middle Ages as well. The pilgrimage roads, or routes, were followed by Christian pilgrims converging on especially holy places. They were linked to the Crusades, wars waged by European armies to capture the Holy Land from the Muslims. The religious impulse behind the Crusades was sometimes devout, sometimes pretext, and often probably a bit of both. That territorial conquest was part of the equation is obvious. And of course, trade and other economic consequences flowed from these ventures. The First Crusade was a partial success, since the Christian forces conquered Jerusalem in 1099. Jerusalem immediately became a pilgrimage goal for those who could afford to traverse such a long distance, and it usually meant, for northern Europeans, traveling to the Mediterranean by land routes as a rule, and then sailing for the Near East from there. Rome was an obvious pilgrimage goal because it was the seat of the papacy, and St. Peter's, in the old St. Peter's built by Constantine, was there, and many, many famous churches were visited by pilgrims to Rome. Pilgrims to Rome from the north of Italy generally went by land, some sailed, but usually by land crossing the Alps. But the most important pilgrimage site in the 11th and 12th centuries I've mentioned, Santiago de Compostela in the northwest corner of Spain. This was the spot dedicated to St. James the Greater, or St. James Major, the apostle whose martyred body, according to legend, came to Spain in a boat without sails, landing at Compostela, where he was buried, where a cathedral was subsequently constructed. St. James in Spanish is Santiago, I-A-G-O, and Santiago is the patron saint of Spain. Another legend recounted James's miraculous appearance in the early 10th century as a warrior on horseback who repelled the Moorish army's advance through Spain toward Europe. And these two things were the reasons for the devotion to his cult, which was incredibly widespread. The legend may have been invented as well to encourage pilgrimage to Santiago. These things have a way of intermingling. There were 4 major pilgrimage roads to Santiago. And I show you a map which is easier to read. One began in Paris, you see at the top clearly. Another began in Vézelay, which is in Burgundy, and which is right here. Yet another began at Le Puy, down here, which is near the Rhone. Another, surprisingly perhaps, at Arles. We just saw Saint-Trophime at Arles, but people would gather from other parts of Europe, particularly those coming from the east, often gather in Arles, form large groups, and head off from there. In this case, more or less a straight shot. Of course, you had to get across the Pyrenees, which wasn't that easy, but they could go directly from there. And as I said, there were all of these interim routes. Here also is one from Chartres, which joins the one from Paris and continues on down through Bordeaux and so forth. Some of the most famous pilgrimage road churches, by the way, are in the center part of France here, and you see a lot of names grouped together here: Périgueux, Souillac, Conques, Moissac. These are all important names. And up near Vézelay, you'll see Dijon and Autun, which we'll be hearing about Autun. These journeys were made on foot. People traveled, and they traveled principally on foot. And since the pilgrims required food and lodging and other care for their long trip, numerous churches and monasteries were built, some in cities, others in rural areas that were near convenient routes south, for instance, in valleys. The religious establishments provided both physical and spiritual necessities for a price, and the towns in their vicinity also benefited from this religious tourism. The cult of relics, bones of saints, and other items associated with saints grew during this period, since the possession of relics by a church gave that church a very special attraction, a reason for a pilgrim to choose among the several routes to Santiago. This brief background, and it is brief, of the pilgrimage roads helps, I hope, to understand why the churches of the Romanesque period in France are so widely scattered across the area, across the country. For example, Saint-Lazare at Autun. Here is Autun again, near Dijon, Vézelay, south of Dijon. It is an ancient city founded, like Trier, by the Emperor Augustus. An important center. It has one of the most important Romanesque churches in Saint-Lazare, meaning Saint Lazarus, he who was raised from the dead in one of Christ's early miracles. The extant ruins in the city gave the medieval builders many ideas, and there were at least two Roman gates standing, and so there were lots of ideas, both structural and decorative, but it's the sculpture that I choose to look at now. We have talked about the tympanum briefly when we looked at Saint-Trophime. Here is the tympanum above the door, the lunette, at Autun of St. Lazarus, the Church of St. Lazarus. The sculpture here is, as was common, the Last Judgment. It sort of wakes you up to enter church under the Last Judgment and exit church under the Last Judgment. There are other reasons, we'll touch on it, but it is the principal theme, I would think, during this period. This was carved between 1120 and 1130, and rarely it's a signed work of art. One of the very rare artists whom we know by name in the Middle Ages, Gieslebertus, or Gieslebertus. I do not know whether it's a hard or a soft G. It is presumed that he designed not only this, but that he designed, and he or his workshop carved the other sculptures in the cathedral as well. And there are some remarkable inventions among them. Look for just a moment before I go into the cathedral at this Last Judgment. There's a particular characteristic about it, and that's its flatness. The sculpture is relief sculpture, but remarkably flattened. The surfaces don't bulge out, but seem to be conceived in a compressed fashion, and they're elongated. There's a tremendous amount of expressionism in the figures, pulled out like El Greco's of the 12th century. They're quite remarkable. And while there are wonderful details here, I'm going to pass on to the interior, to this capital. Capitals were very important as a sculptural field for Romanesque sculptors. How difficult to take this squarish but angular surface, a kind of inverted pyramid, and turn it into a narrative area. Very hard and very demanding of the sculptor. In this case, the subject is the hanging of Judas. Now, Judas committed suicide after his betrayal of Christ. But if you look at this, he's getting more than a little assistance from two demons who are only too happy to receive him into hell. And they want his soul. And they really look like they are taking a quite active role in this, quote, suicide. And it's startlingly real, too. Look at his open mouth and the broken neck. I mean, the artist in a very, very small compass manages to really convince you of this. And also it has to be seen from the floor, and they can be. They are legible, like stained glass is. They are legible because the forms are simple. Now I turn to another of the capitals, one of my favorites, the Annunciation to the Magi. The Magi were sleeping at an inn, I suppose, and they were sharing a bed, which was very common. Everybody shared beds, but here they quite literally are sharing a bed, and this wonderful sweeping coverlet over them, beautiful curve of the design, just superb. And they're fast asleep, except that an angel has appeared to tell them to follow the star, which is right here, right above the Magi's heads, and he's pointing at it, and he touches with his finger this king, and whose eyes suddenly go wide open. He's wide awake, and in a moment they will be gathering themselves together to follow the star. It's this sophisticated naivete that is so wonderful in Romanesque art. The stories are told in an unforgettable fashion. One of the most amazing pieces at Autun is this, The Temptation of Eve. There are very few nudes in Romanesque art. We've seen, and obviously Adam and Eve give you the opportunity. But this Eve is very different. She used to be on a lintel, on a lateral door at Autun, but damaged. It was moved into a museum there. But here she is crawling along the lintel, as it were, through the vegetation, some of which looks rather serpent-like over here, doesn't it? Like the tempter, although it is vegetation clearly and stalks. She reaches back with one hand to pluck the apple as she crawls on her way. Originally, Adam was on the other side and the devil was in the middle. Conques is a town on a pilgrimage route between Le Puy and Moissac on the way to Toulouse. In a pastoral setting, an unforgettable pastoral setting, is a church dedicated to a child saint, a small girl martyred at an unknown date. Her name is Sainte Foy. Foi means faith, and she was much venerated in England as well as France, although her legend is late in date and possibly unhistorical. Not that it matters, for in matters of faith it is belief and the results of belief that count. That her legend inspired this fine church and its decoration is sufficient justification for me. I want to show you, and am showing you, the Last Judgment on its portal, an extraordinary, sweeping Last Judgment with Christ in the middle, flanked by saints and so forth. And on the lower level, the lowest lintel level, on his right are the blessed, the saved, and on the left are the damned. First, I'll show you a close-up of the upper center, the enthroned Christ, surrounded by the symbols of the evangelists, other figures, some of them on the left, clearly suggesting pilgrims, I think. And then in the area just below that upper level, and just before you get, just before you get to the blessed, tucked in this little corner, we have Sainte Foy herself. That's her kneeling, little child saint, and the hand of God blessing her and seeing her into eternity, which lies just below her. There they are. You can see her still at the top of this image. There they are, a series of figures in arcades looking quite content and safe. And if you look over to the right of that, you will see that there are figures being welcomed, perhaps by an angel, perhaps by St. Peter, but being welcomed into heaven. Here's the door, right here, a wonderful medieval door which is opened, and they enter. In the center, you get an old patriarch embracing two of them. This is Abraham. You know the phrase, the bosom of Abraham, that appears in gospel songs. Well, here they are, safe in the bosom of Abraham. On the other side, the damned have not been so fortunate. If you look at the left side of this detail, they're being clubbed and pushed into the literal mouth of hell. It's a great beast. Pushed into it, and here's the door again, looking not as attractive as the door into heaven, with a heavy lock on it. And there they are, being pushed into the mouth of hell and falling into hell. And this figure, you can tell he's got a helmet on, he's got mail on. He is a knight. Knights are a symbol of pride. Pride goeth before a fall. And he's falling on his head into eternal damnation. In another church on the pilgrimage roads, Souillac, there is a wonderful image, Isaiah. Isaiah is a prophet. Originally, this was on the front of the church. It was moved inside from the jamb of the old west portal. It dates from the first third of the 12th century. The prophet Isaiah was believed to have prophesied the birth of Christ. And he holds a vertical scroll, which once had the words of his prophecy painted on it, but I think nothing is left. The drama here, though, is in the twisting posture of Isaiah. His left leg swung around in front of his right, his head turning back to gaze at us. His long, agitated beard shares in the excitement, as do the long counter curves of the broad edges of his robe. There is an appropriately frenzied air to his announcement. Some have referred to this Isaiah as the dancing prophet, but I'm more inclined to associate it with, let's say, the great choral music of Handel, and it's very ahistorical of me, unhistorical, but in the 18th century, because the text that soon follows in the book of Isaiah was what Handel said in the Messiah: "For unto us a child is given, unto us a child is born, unto us a child is given," and that it concludes, and look at this figure, "Wonderful Counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace." That's the ecstatic quality, the thrill that this anonymous sculptor manages to incorporate into his Isaiah. Less than 100 miles from Paris, the abbey at Vézelay was founded in Carolingian times, but gained its first distinction during the 11th century, when the supposed relics of Mary Magdalene were brought there. And it became an important pilgrimage site. This is the nave of Vézelay, a beautiful nave distinguished by those striped cross ribs. Built about 1120 to 1132, its greatest historical fame is connected to the Crusades. The first crusade was not convened here. It was supposed to be, but it wasn't. But the second crusade was convened here when the great Cistercian abbot, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, preached the sermon in 1146, which launched that crusade. Although I show you the beautiful nave, you should know that the throng of barons and clergy from all over Europe who gathered at Vézelay was so enormous that the event took place outside the walls of the city. The crowd who knelt before Bernard to dedicate themselves to the crusade included King Louis VII and his queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. That the Second Crusade was a disaster did not lessen the fame of Vézelay as one of the major starting points of the pilgrimage roads. And in 1190, Philip Augustus, King of France, and Richard the Lion-Hearted met here to set aside their differences and unite on the Third Crusade. In 1120, on the eve of the July pilgrimage, the church at Vézelay was destroyed in a tragic fire which claimed 1,000 lives, a startling number. And it reminds us of how many pilgrims gathered here to set out on the pilgrimage roads. The rebuilding of the church began immediately, and the nave was complete by 1132. In this handsome nave are famous historiated capitals, that is, with sculptured scenes such as we have seen, and I show you one. Noah building the ark. Noah with some help, and they each have an axe, one hewing away, and they seem to be using some sort of materials to almost basket weave the ark here, using vines perhaps that he is weaving together. But the most famous sculptural monument at Vézelay is in the narthex. You will recall that Abbot Suger had a new large narthex at Saint-Denis to ease the entrance of crowds into the church, and so it is at Vézelay. The portal of the Mission of the Apostles is inside, not on the facade, but in the narthex at the entrance into the nave, above that door. And the subject is not the Last Judgment, but the Mission of the Apostles, which is so significant here. 1120 to 1132, the approximate date. Many, perhaps most, of the tympanum sculptures of the Romanesque are the Last Judgment. That this highly original subject is at Vézelay obviously reflects the church's fame as the starting point on the pilgrimage road. The subject is from the opening verses of the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, which recounts that Jesus showed himself alive after his passion and instructed the apostles to be witnesses to him unto the uttermost ends of the earth. And when he had spoken these things, while they beheld, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And you can see the cloud on either side of the shoulders of Christ as he is being assumed into that cloud. The figure of Jesus is in a mandorla, that almond-shaped halo that indicates both his ascension and the emanation of sacred light. The apostles flank him. This central subject has a distinctive and expressive design. The figures, especially of Jesus, are flattened, as we saw at Autun, into a kind of high relief rather than sculpture in the round. Their poses are angular, sharply pointed, jutting knees, and their clothing is incised with sharp, moving lines that describe the drapery, but are even more important as indicators of spiritual emotion. From his hands, rays of the Holy Spirit descend onto the heads of the apostles, empowering them for their missions. Each of them also holds a book, a copy of the gospel. The small compartments which surround it have many striking figures who represent the people of the earth to whom the apostles will bear the gospel and to whom they will attempt to convert to the new faith. These extraordinary beings are based upon descriptions that very imaginative travelers returning from far-off lands had regaled their friends at home with, and which were published. For instance, in this little compartment just to the right of Christ's head are the so-called pig-snouted Ethiopians, described in a pilgrim's report. This is what he saw, and this is what he tells us about. Vézelay is a marvelous church in a historically protected city, which still retains the afterglow of the Middle Ages. It's one of the finest monuments of the Romanesque and leaves us on the threshold of the next moment in medieval culture, the Gothic era. Thank you again for your attention.